Welcome to Town Hall Thursdays. I am Darryl W. Perry, Libertarian for Governor. I'm joined this week by Robert Daniel, who is Libertarian running for state rep in Hillsborough 11, which is Manchester's Ward 4, which is actually only a few blocks away from where I live. Robert, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So just first, before we jump into there's actually, a couple of big news stories out this week. Joe Biden, I almost called him Dan Quell for some reason. Joe Biden, the Democratic presumptive nominee for president, I think it becomes official in 4 days from the day that we're recording this. If you're watching at a later date, it's already happened, and you know the past. I don't know the future. But he has announced that Kamala Harris is going to be his VP. So I guess defund the police has become make the police the vice president. I definitely want to, sort of talk about that. Plus the lawsuit that was filed by the ACLU actually was jointly by the ACLU of New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine over internal border patrol checkpoints, specifically one set up in New Hampshire. But I want to talk about your run for state rep, what your primary issues are, what made you decide that you wanted to run for state rep and get paid that big, huge, giant check of $100 per year.
Well, hey, for some of us, that $100 per year is a bonus, Teachers don't get paid all that well, especially if you work in the private sector. That's good. No, seriously, a lot of things went into it, and I don't mind doing it just as a service, not for money. But the idea, first of all, that we need a third party. We need to, anybody who's tired of the two major parties, the duopoly, and I would think that would be everybody by now, but apparently it isn't, needs to step forward and do whatever they can. I can run for office. I've been in New Hampshire for 4 years now, so this is the one position I'm qualified to run for. I haven't been here that long. I have a background in political science, graduate school and so on, so I have some credentials. I think I've got some good qualities for being a rep. But most of all, I'm just fed up, and I'm fed up on many levels. With the widespread assault on the economy by the two mainstream parties and all that entails for everybody, rich or poor, so on. And also, the state of the education system. Again, I'm an educator. I've forsworn working in the public school system. I've been in it, not as a teacher, but as educational support and so on, although I've been a credentialed teacher. I've seen it from the inside in several states, and I just have no words for it. There's so much wrong with it. So I hope to help change that through legislation and be a good advocate for school choice, or should I say educational choice, because education includes more than just schools. So that is my main issue, but it's certainly not the only one. There's many reasons that I'm choosing to run, Darryl, but many of them will be familiar to you, I'm sure.
Yeah. So regarding the education, and I'm glad that you're using the term education choice instead of school choice. There are a lot of approaches that people can take to, politically move towards that. One of them is sort of a school voucher system, which I forget if the ESA, the Education Savings Account, I forget if that wound up passing a couple of years ago.
It did not.
The proposal was something kind of like a voucher system, but the supporters of it swore up and down it's not a voucher, but it acts very much like the voucher systems that are set up everywhere else where there are school vouchers.
There are some surface similarities with it, but it is technically not a voucher. But what it would do is allow people, and I do hope it comes back so that I can vote for it and make the difference this time. It was defeated in committee. It was actually voted in by the legislature, if I remember correctly, and I'm not sure that I do. But it was very close. I remember watching it intensely in the last moments. And eventually it went to committee and was defeated. Main opposition to it, incidentally, sidebar, was I think along religious lines, that people did not want these to be used for religious schools, so on.
Right, and
God forbid.
Well, there's currently a state law that says that private funding can't go to religious organizations.
Right. It is, in fact,
So,
part of the New Hampshire Constitution. So they have a valid point there.
yeah.
But
Which also, I'm glad you mentioned the New Hampshire Constitution, because in the same section, I forget which article it is, where it talks about we shall cherish education. And of course, the Supreme Court back whatever year it was, close to a decade ago, I believe, in the Claremont decision, said, well, cherish education means that the local government should have to pay for education. But in the same sentence, it also says that we should cherish the arts and seminary. But nobody has interpreted that cherish the arts and seminary means that taxpayers should have to pay for those things. So I know that there's a lot of people, especially the more right-leaning conservatives and conservatarians, have been arguing that we need to somehow legislatively reverse that Claremont decision. So, even if you're not, fully aware of the specifics of the case or what the court ruled in that decision, what are your thoughts on somehow having a legislative solution to basically reverse a judicial decision that I believe was incorrect?
Okay, could we summarize that decision again? Are you talking about the part where you cannot use money for, or the state is involved in education, or the part where it's not involved in religion, which you're concerned with particularly?
No. So the Claremont decision was interpreted to mean that local municipalities must provide education to the children in their municipality.
That should absolutely be overturned, because it should, education above all, everything should be a personal choice. But education above all, because it's the core of everything else. It is the core of whether kids become productive citizens or not. It's the core of whether they lead happy lives or not. It is a very individualized thing. Every kid needs an education which is tailored to themselves. The methods, the site, who their teachers are should be a choice and all that. You give it to any level of government to decide, and especially if you make it mandatory, which every law, federal or local or state, is doing, then you have what somebody we both know called a one-size-fits-few system. I love that term. That's what we got. You get one-size-fits-few education. It doesn't work for the vast majority of kids. So I would definitely work to defeat that and bring in the education vouchers that vouchers or education savings accounts, to use the correct term, that we were talking about. And I'd like to come back to education savings accounts too, just to answer, if you don't mind, for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to, I was on the way to clearing up that question about whether it's a voucher or not. So what an educational savings account would do for the uninitiated is allow parents to use their state tax portion of the education budget, which is about a third of the money that is spent in public school education here, to about $6,000 or $7,000 a year, to their choice of school, private schools, or even for homeschool, anything related to formal education for their kids. Homeschooling supplies, hiring a teacher to homeschool your kids, anything like that. So there are subtle differences, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert on it, but there are subtle differences between that and a voucher. And it would be administered privately. That was one difference. So it would be really nice if that would come to pass. And that would also alleviate the pressure, I think, on the municipalities in the first place. Instead of dumping the issue on them, you must provide this. Well, let everyone provide it for themselves. And what is forgotten by the opposition to these things is that, religious or not, whatever one's motivations are for withdrawing your children from the public school, or even put them into a charter school, because that's one of the options for education savings accounts too, charter or public, but you can spend it there. What people forget is that those people are taxpayers. Every parent is a taxpayer, and it's their money, literally.
Right.
What is the basis for denying them to even put their kids in a religious school if they want to? You are forcing them to pay taxes to educate other people's children in ways that contradict their personal values. So then how can you turn around and use that same argument against one group, one sector of society? I don't like the religious schools, but by God, they're going to pay for 100% of the population to be educated in secular values that they don't like.
Right.
That's mixed up.
Yeah, and you mentioned charter schools as an alternative to public schools, but charter schools actually are public.
No, I said they are public. I said it's
Yeah.
one option that you could use the education savings
Oh, okay. I
speak
heard
loudly
that
enough.
as an alternative to, but there
to
are
the
a
other
lot of,
public schools.
yeah,
They
there
are
are a
public,
lot
yes.
of people that they think that charter schools aren't public.
A lot, and it's
when they,
not true.
most definitely are. But one question that I have, and if you don't know the answer, that's fine. With the education savings account, let's say, well, and we live in neighboring wards in Manchester.
Yeah.
I don't have kids in the public school system. I don't know if you do
No,
either.
I don't have
But
kids in general.
let's, for the sake of argument, say that we do. And, neither one of us are happy with whatever the school is in our designated district. With an education savings account, could we send our kids to another public school in a neighboring district, or even in a district, in a completely different town that is not adjacent to where we live?
The thing about transferring students anywhere in America, not just New Hampshire, the thing about transferring students from one district to another is the host district, the district you actually live in, is of course responsible for the kids primarily. You would have to make a case to make that transfer. It's not about money. You have to make a case for transferring, like say the kid needs special ed services that your district can't provide because it's a small rural district, whatever. And I've worked in that situation in Candia. Once you make that case and both districts agree to the transfer, then, as I understand it, then that other district becomes the host district for your kid, and then all the funding goes to there because the funding is allocated by the government for the public schools.
Right.
What you could do is go to a charter school outside of your district, and then that's just, you already have freedom of choice, but you have to go through the lottery system to get into those charter schools anyway.
And I know that when I lived in Keene, several of the neighboring towns did not actually have schools of their own. So they would have agreements with either Keene or the Monadnock School District or one of the other ones. But some of the towns had agreements with multiple, and then it was up to the parents to decide which of these districts do you want your kids to go to. So there actually was freedom of choice by that municipality not having its own school. Even though they still were complying with the law by providing for the education, by making the monies available and then paying tuition to whatever the other district.
Right. And at that point, those alternative schools become effectively your local school district's school, called School of Record is what it is. I went through that, and I saw that in action in Candia, where they didn't have a high school. They don't have a high school because it's too small a district. So first they were with Manchester, and right around the time I worked at Henry Moore School, they were switching over to Pinkerton. Lucky kids. Pinkerton's an excellent school. It breaks my heart to see it start to join the public school system and get corrupted, but it's a dynamite school, and I'd love to work there someday. I'm trying to get there. Everyone wants to work there too. Anyways, long story short, so that's an example, but they only had one choice. First it was Manchester, then they switched from Manchester to Pinkerton, and yeah.
So, just one more thing on the education. I know that a lot of people, especially, in a certain segment, I don't want to, call out which segment of the population it is, but as I described this, you may know who it is. But there's a certain segment of the population that, as opposed to the quote unquote Common Core system of education, because
Darryl, that's just about everybody.
Right, but I hear it mostly from people that have, fill in the blank conspiracy theory about what Common Core means. I have relatives that are educators, and as it's been explained to me, the purpose of Common Core is that way if somebody moves from, let's just say, Portsmouth to Manchester, they're not going to have a wildly different curriculum from what they were used to to what they're moving into. So the
broader than
seventh
that,
grade math in Portsmouth should be the same as the seventh grade math in Manchester.
yeah. I mean, it's broader than that. It's outside of the state. It's a national standards, at least for the core subjects, the language arts and his mathematics. Freudian slip, I said history there because that's being sort of absorbed in the language arts into some hybrid called humanities, language and humanities, whatever. But yeah, so it's also, if you leave the state, you'll get basically the same math and language arts curriculum, which is kind of a chimera because how that curriculum is interpreted, and we started this conversation with that word interpretation, and I was thinking, oh, there's the major word there.
Right.
Things are interpreted and very broadly. So even though in writing you have something that's common, it's not all that common still. And frankly, it's just a permutation on what every state already had. I just don't see the point in spending all those billions of dollars and years of work hours creating it. There's nothing fundamental that changed, and a lot needs to change in it. But I'm sorry, what was your, I preempted you a bit there. What was your question about Common Core?
Yeah. So I know that there's also been legislation in New Hampshire to oppose any Common Core standards because people interpret, and we're talking about some of the 400 legislators, not just like, oh yeah, Bob that lives down the street with a crazy conspiracy theory, but a lot of times Bob down the street with the crazy conspiracy theory gets elected to the legislature because we have so many of them. So, there's been legislation about not allowing school districts to adopt Common Core standards. There have been proposals to not allow any kind of educational survey to be conducted by the schools or by teachers because, well, I saw on Facebook that this school over here was asking people if their parents had guns, and they only did that because of Common Core. So if you were elected, would you necessarily take steps to do away with Common Core, or is that just something that you wouldn't necessarily act on, but if the bill came up, you'd take a look at it and make a informed decision?
Okay, a lot to say on this one.
Yes.
First of all, I think the best way to do away with Common Core is deep breath, withdraw all your kids from the public system. We have good options in the private sector, notwithstanding all the pressures that governments and many political elites put against it. So I do away with the Common Core by the way I teach. But seriously, as a legislator, that's a serious question. First thing that comes to mind is it would depend on what it's replaced with. I am all for getting rid of government school curriculum as it stands now, because there's a lot, especially in the social sciences, my field. Well, I'll say it flat out. And one of the things that brings me to this, to politics, is I want the brainwashing to end. It is so politically agenda-laden, the social sciences curriculum and everything has been for a long time. And call me conspiratorial if you like, but I know where that began, and it's deliberate. So I would first answer your question with, what are we going to replace it with? Something better or something worse? Who is going to replace it? Who's going to design what we replace it with? Well, we pretty much have path dependency now on who designs the curriculums for the schools in America, for the government schools. So it'd be the same people designing it, and going to be careful that we don't step on a landmine there and have them give us something that's even worse.
And as I understand it,
I don't know.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I understand it, with only a handful of companies that provide textbooks, they basically write the textbooks to whatever the largest purchasers want, and that's generally California and or Texas.
True. Don't even get me started about textbooks. It's a major racket. That's something that technically it is free market, but not really. I mean, don't even get me started on the textbook racket. I don't want to go there. But yes, I've seen that too as a community college, as I teach community college part-time, Great Bay, teach U.S. history. And I saw that exact same thing. So I'm sorry, what exactly is your question about textbooks? But
oh, you were there wasn't a question. It was a statement. where you said, what are we going to replace it with?
Oh, and you're
And
comparing the
I was
textbooks,
just,
isn't it? Like, yeah.
saying like, because schools are generally going to, adopt a curriculum based on what textbooks are available. And if there's only two options for, here's a 10th grade history book, one written by, McGraw-Hill and one written by whoever the other textbook company is, but they're
Houghton
basically
Mifflin.
the same, you don't really have a choice. Yes, there's that supposed free market because, well, you can buy any of the textbooks that are on the market. It's kind of like the Model T. You can have a Model T in any color you want, as long as it's
black. Yeah, classic line. The same thing applies here. Yeah, and it applies to much more than just textbooks. Everything in our society is being co-opted by people of the same worldview and political goals and everything. So choices are being eliminated left, right, and center in America and the world deliberately, cynically. But back to textbooks, you've got millions of textbooks, and yeah, they're all colored black, or whatever you want to say. There are two producers, but the textbook racket is academics who wouldn't really be able to construct a really good textbook and sell it on its own merits in the market. They don't have to, because we have piles of money, taxpayer money, going to student loans to do what? To purchase textbooks at ridiculously inflated prices. What do the schools do? They make the textbook mandatory, so everyone has no choice but to buy their textbook with stolen money. And what does that? Where does that stolen money ultimately go? To the friends of the people who create these laws and everything.
Yeah.
Right. The textbook are academics within that same circle with the same worldview, and they just regurgitate the same stuff. They do a mild permutation on everybody else's textbooks. And so you're saying, how would school choice be affected? How would Common Core affected as a comparison here? Yeah, elimination of choices is done by stealth, and textbooks are a good analogy. Yeah.
So let's jump into the ACLU lawsuit
Sure.
against the Border Patrol, where, again, New Hampshireites are very familiar with the I guess annual practice, although sometimes it does happen more than once a year, where the Border Patrol sets up on US 93, somewhere near the town of Woodstock, where basically the only way to get around that, if you're heading south from the North Country, is to drive over to Maine or into Vermont.
Yeah.
And you have to know many miles beforehand, because I think that's where US 3 and 93 merge together. So, if you're heading south on either of the main roads, you're stuck and have to go through this checkpoint. There was the state Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago saying that the local police couldn't be involved with the drug dogs being there. And, well, most of the arrest that had happened at this one particular checkpoint in 2017, that's the subject of this lawsuit,
Right.
being filed by
They were drug related.
Jesse Druniak. All of the arrests were drug related. There were
Right.
no immigration arrests at all.
Yeah, this is typical of many things that the major parties do in government. First of all, I find it laughable that they're trying to stop illegal immigration coming from Canada, even if that is a laudable goal, which it's not. Immigration should be free, and I'm for a world without borders, but we don't have one right now. So if we could liberalize our immigration policy, I'm all in favor of that, especially as an immigrant myself, which I am. But that they're trying to, or putting across that they're trying to catch immigrants. Well, across the border without telling the government beforehand, coming from the southern border. Yeah, some of them slip through Canada. Okay, but so I find it hard to believe that that really is their goal. Is just what I'm saying. And even if it was, it would not be a good goal. I would certainly oppose that tooth and nail if I was in the legislature.
Right. There's also a large number of the people that are here illegally came on valid visas.
Mm-hmm.
They came on valid documents, and then either their document expired, the visa didn't get renewed properly, there was some kind of paperwork error, and so that's why their status has changed. But again, this is basically a drug checkpoint under the guise of, well, we need to stop immigrants that are in the White Mountains for some weird reason.
Yeah, and it's obvious bullshit. And where I was going when I made that comment a second ago, this is typical of what the government does in so many other ways. Both major parties do it. They pretend they're doing one thing and they're really up to doing the other, or both. You know, one way that you get to do or try to do something that you know is going to be unpopular, if you want to do it for your own benefit anyways, is you masquerade it as something else, and you may be legitimately doing that other thing. But the reality you're doing. Yeah, they do that with a million things. Yeah, I have no words for it. It's just.
So let me ask this question, because, you know, as a candidate for governor, I have thoughts on ways that we could, you know, prevent this from happening. But as a state rep candidate, do you think that there's a legislative way to tell the feds that they can't do this? Or is there, you know, because of the supposed supremacy clause and preemption by the federal government, the feds are just going to say, well, we can do it because we're the feds and you're just a lowly state, even though New Hampshire was one of the states that created the federal government?
I think you've got to be careful with pulling the lion's tail. Federal government can and will do whatever they feel like doing. Look at the president that we have now, who hopefully won't get reelected. It doesn't look like he's going to. But if we had to have that battle with him, look at the way he's reacted to the violence that's going on in the major cities. And anytime there's a governor who's not responding to it the way that Trump would like, which generally is when they're a Democrat, but whatever reason, he just jumps in and does whatever he wants, even if it's illegal. And even if the police wind up harassing peaceful protesters, as they're constantly doing. Same thing here. If we passed legislation in our small state, our small, not very powerful state, that offended a leader like Trump, scratch the word leader, he's no leader, but, you know, all hell would break loose. You've got to do it diplomatically. You've got to work through many channels and things that are beyond me as a state rep. That would fall to you as a governor. I'd like to know what you would do outside of legislation. I want to know what your ideas are for legislation too, but I think we could pass laws, but it would depend largely on who's in power. We've got to know who's in power first. Who's the president? What is the mood in Congress? All the parties in Congress. Hopefully there will be 3 next time. But whatever. You know, before we do the last thing, think through all the channels first. How would you handle it as governor? Say if Biden's the president, he seems like the most likely one. I hope it's Jorgensen, but Biden's highest in the polls right now.
Yeah, so I could see a few different ways to handle this. You could, of course, you know, instruct the state police to not only not cooperate with Border Patrol, but if you see them set up, arrest them for trespass. I realize they're doing it on a federal highway, so they're going to claim, you know, some sort of they've got ownership. But I would arrest them for trespassing in the state. I could also see, and this is something that has happened numerous times, where one house or the other in the New Hampshire General Court, generally it's the House of Representatives and not so much the Senate doing this, just passing a resolution urging Congress to take action on fill in the blank thing. And in this case, it would be to urge Congress to stop having internal border checkpoints. Because even in the Southwest, on either side of El Paso, and I forget which side of El Paso the westbound checkpoint is and which side of El Paso the eastbound checkpoint is. But okay, yes, like there is a part of El Paso, and I've gone through checkpoints on both sides several times. But there's one part of El Paso where you can actually see the border fence between El Paso and Mexico. That's not where the checkpoint is. the checkpoint's like 20, 30 miles outside of the city limits, nowhere near the border. Like you're a good 25, 30 miles away from the border at that point, because the road just sort of winds up. But again, that's a permanent checkpoint that is always there and has been there for at least 2.5 decades that I'm aware of.
And it's been there that far away from the border because it's really not a border checkpoint. Same things here. They're actually pursuing something else, drugs or whatever.
Well, no, that they're saying it is a border checkpoint because, well, here's the main road that gets you to and fro. There's not really any other roads south of there. But again, it's largely this fishing expedition of we're looking for other things, but every now and then we catch somebody. And if you want to avoid it, you've got to drive 100 miles out of the way to go, up and around and over, and nobody does that. So I could see, especially with a lot of the stuff that people are getting fed up about with families being separated at the border, the migrant detention centers, where, I forget how many thousand children have been sent one place and the parents went somewhere else. Well, we forget where the parents of this kid went, and then kids wind up getting, reconnected with a completely different family. So there's a lot of people that are getting upset. So I could see Congress possibly taking action to sort of roll in or rein back some of the stuff that's happening specifically with immigration enforcement. But it's not going to happen with a Republican president. It's not going to happen with a Republican majority in
I would
either
argue that
house
it's not going to happen
Congress.
with either major party.
I don't think it's going to happen with the Democrats either, but they might give some kind of lip service, kind of like what they did with the Justice and Policing Act that they passed, where they said that it did all of these, good sounding things, but if you actually look at what they passed, it's like, well, it does this in this very small area, but there's enough loopholes to where you could drive all of the Mack trucks that Evel Knievel jumped over side by side through this thing.
Mm-hmm. And on the subject of something like loopholes, I did have an evil idea and answer to the question. If I was governor, what I would do is I'd take over the burden from the feds, play their own game. You seem to be very concerned with our border with Canada. It should be a state issue.
I'm actually not concerned about the border with Canada.
Oh, I know. But what I'm saying is, I didn't mean you. I'm saying, imagine yourself
you're
saying
talking
this.
about the feds. Okay.
Yeah, I should say. You're negotiating with Congress, president, whoever. You'd say, I, Governor Perry, noticed that you're kind of concerned with New Hampshire's border with Canada. In exchange for something, we will take over the border checkpoints for you, and we'll do it locally with New Hampshire police. You fill in the dots, Libertarian to Libertarian. We both oppose this. Do things by stealth like they do.
I'm fairly certain that if Dr. Jorgensen gets elected president, she's not going to authorize the internal border checkpoints anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Because we actually had a conversation about this a couple of weeks ago when I had her on the town hall. And I've got Spike Cohen, the vice presidential nominee, on next week.
Oh, excellent. Definitely going to be here for that.
Yeah.
I'm very impressed with Spike. I wasn't sure when they were first getting nominated and everything, but he impressed me right away. He is really doing a good job of being the mature VP candidate, and at the same time, the one who's really going to connect with the younger voters and disenfranchised voter and so on. We got a good ticket. And what you said about Jorgensen just now, I'd be surprised if she did anything different. It is truly in her core values. I've talked to her personally too before the nomination, and I got a sense of what she really believes personally against the abolition of drugs, the prohibition, I should say, of drugs, and the harassment of people by the border checkpoints and so on. She'll put a stop to it, and we should hope that she becomes president.
Yep. And prohibition of drugs, that's obviously another big, huge, giant thing, because again, talking about these border checkpoints where it's really just a search for, can we find some drugs on somebody? And Matt Simon of the Marijuana Policy Project, he's called New Hampshire an island of prohibition, which we are, because all of our neighbors have, to some extent, legalized the possession and or distribution, or both, of cannabis. But
not us.
in northern New England slash French Canada, we are the only political entity that does not allow this. So if you want to legally obtain cannabis, you've got to go across the border somewhere, but then you violate a law by bringing it back.
Yep. Every state's got their thing. If it isn't cannabis, it's firearms or it's something else. Even though alcohol's legal, sometimes you cannot take it across state borders because of some antiquated laws.
Yep.
So technically, we do have prohibition of everything.
Yeah. And
everything's prohibited somehow.
I am mildly amused that you mentioned fireworks, because our neighbors to the south, Massachusetts, they don't have legal fireworks. So a lot of people from Massachusetts drive north, buy fireworks, and our fairly cheap liquor from the state liquor store. And then they head back south, and sometimes they get caught with what they've bought, sometimes they don't. And having grown up in Alabama, I'm very familiar with the concept of dry counties. Where
do they still have them?
Yes,
I thought that was unconstitutional now. I mean, I know it is.
It might be, but
sure, the constitutional amendment that repealed prohibition. Repealed prohibition.
You're talking
federal constitution.
That repealed the federal laws. It did not repeal the state laws. Which is how there's all kinds of laws on what the alcohol limit can be from state to state on beer. But there are dry counties where if you have more than a certain amount of alcohol on you and you're driving through the county and you get pulled over for anything and the cops find it, they seize it. And until Alabama changed some of their craft brewing laws to allow alcohol or to allow beer above like 5.5% or 6%, I know people that they were making regular felony trips to Georgia to buy some of these higher alcohol beers, and then they'd drive back home and they'd have to drive through numerous dry counties where not only was the possession of this 10% alcohol beer illegal to possess in Alabama, but they had over 24 beers or 12 or whatever it was that made it illegal in that municipality. Interestingly enough, generally the police departments that seized these illegal beers, a couple of weeks later, they'd have a nice party for themselves. It's one of these things.
Just like the 1920s.
Yeah, rules for me, or rules for thee, but not for me, is how a lot of these things wind up getting interpreted. But as you mentioned, everything to some degree or another is regulated.
Yeah, and all the prohibition down to a 1. Every case of prohibition is a massive failure. Even makes things worse. Look at all the things that are prohibited writ large, from prostitution to marijuana and a million other drugs and so on. It just made it worse,
right?
More unsafe and unsavory.
Drives it into the black market.
Yeah, where really unsavory people, instead of legitimate business people and entrepreneurs, take over, and there's no real safety checks like you would have in a totally free market.
Right, and that's what makes it dangerous. Where if I go to if I go to CVS and I buy a product and I get harmed because of the product that I bought at CVS, harmed not by I used it wrong, so therefore,
no, by some negligence, they're selling you snake oil and it doesn't work.
And it's something that they know is going to potentially harm me. I have legal recourse. Whereas in the black market, specifically with drugs, if you buy something from somebody and it turns out to not be what you thought it was, you can't go file a small claims case. You can't file something through the legal process,
right?
you complain to this person, and then he winds up getting mad because you calling me a liar. You're saying that I cheated you.
Yeah.
And then things get violent because, like, you're ruining my reputation. And that's where the danger comes in. That's why things like the Silk Road, that unfortunately has been shut down, and the creator is serving 2 life sentences plus 40 years. That's why things like that are actually beneficial and cause less harm, because, buyers, they want to have these really high ratings. They want to have these 5-star ratings.
They want to have safety. They want to have protection. They want to know that there's no fraud going on, especially with things that are potentially dangerous.
As a potential buyer, and I will neither admit or deny having ever purchased anything on the dark web, but let's just say as a potential buyer, I want to be able to read these reviews and see that, oh, the stuff being sold by this guy has high reviews. Everybody said it's exactly what the advertisement said. Whereas if I see somebody that, they've got some 5-star reviews and then a lot of 1 or 2-star reviews, and the 1 and 2-star reviews are, I paid for, an ounce and I got 3/4. I paid for this and I tested it and it came back that it, was, a much lower purity. I'm not going to buy from that person. Mm-hmm. And so that's another thing. By forcing things to be done in the black market, where you can't just go down and have the cocaine factory on the corner of Commercial and Bridge Street, there's not going to be those quality checks necessarily.
Right. And let me add something to that. It's very important here, broadly for Americans. Competition. It floors me that in the sea of contradictions that statists have in their belief system and everything, because it's full of contradictions, one is that the very same people who call for prohibition and everything are also anti-free market because they hate the idea of competition. It should be regulated and centralized and whatnot. Well, guess what happens when you shove something into the black market? You get turf wars. It's all about turf wars. You not only not get the quality checking you're talking about, the actual free flow of information that happens in a free market, but not from government and not from the black market.
Right.
You don't get competitors because they tend to murder each other, or things like that. So, and without that competition, you not only, if you find that the product is bad and say you're an addict, you have a medical condition, you need that stuff. Forgive my ignorance about addiction, but I don't see it as a crime. I see it as a medical condition.
It is a medical condition.
And you need your stuff. So if you can't get it because the one person who has the monopoly by force, because in the black market, you can't get it from somewhere else, you're really fucked. And then that's all because we don't like competition, but we do like prohibition.
Right. And
mind-numbing.
Again, the lack of consistent product, that's where a lot of overdoses come from, where it's not necessarily somebody, intentionally taking a much larger dose. It's the product that they had been using for the last 2 to 3 months or whatever time period had been, oh, I need this much to get this high. Mm-hmm. And then something comes in that is a much greater potency, but they don't know that. They take X amount, and then, well, it's 2 to 3 times more potent than what they had been taking. That's where the ODs come from. And
often that's done surreptitiously. The same thugs who do the turf wars, they want to get people hooked, and they're unscrupulous. A legitimate entrepreneur wouldn't engage in that kind of activity. Well, and they have competition to make sure that doesn't happen.
Then there's things to where somebody might have thought that the product was already cut, and so they didn't do the further cut themselves, or just whatever the first inbound supply just happened to be stronger, and they didn't know it. So there's all of this stuff it all boils down to there's not a legal means for people to buy, sell, obtain, distribute. So
and who's really the beneficiary of prohibition? We have to keep in mind the motives of politicians and their friends and so on. It's not altruism. Never is.
Yes.
Somebody benefits from prohibition somehow, and that's why it becomes legislation. And that needs to be looked into more by the average voter.
Luckily,
Find out what's going on.
New Hampshire has a prohibition on private prisons, where I know that, you know, other jurisdictions, they've got the private prisons where the private prison has a contract with the state saying that you, the state, will maintain X% occupancy inside our facility. And if you don't, you will pay us this much money to make up for whatever the difference is. But, you know, asking or answering the question that you asked about, you know, who benefits, well, there's actually a lot of information on the racist origins of drug prohibition to begin with. And if you look at the drugs that are prohibited, it's not the stuff being used by the legislators. Their alcohol is still legal. Their tobacco products are still legal.
Yep.
And, you know, there's still that discrepancy, even though it's come down a little bit on the sentencing between powder cocaine versus crack cocaine. There's still discrepancies there. A lot of states still have laws saying that felons can't vote. Possession over certain amounts of a substance is a felony because, well, if you have that much, we think you're planning to distribute.
Yeah.
Felony. So if you disenfranchise...
In other words, you're competing with our friends. Yeah.
Well, no. It's not that. It's a way to legally disenfranchise a certain percentage of the population.
Yeah.
To where they can't vote in a lot of states. There's some states where even, you know, with some of the protesting that's happening, if anybody in the protest commits a, you know, vandalism act or something that is construed to be rioting, everybody that was there winds up getting the vandalism or rioting charge, which is going to be a felony. So again, basically it's a way to criminalize and then disenfranchise people for exercising their rights to assemble and petition government for redress of grievance. You mentioned Trump's response to some of the violence. There was actually the report that came out, I believe it was a week and a half ago, saying that in Portland, specifically, Portland, Oregon, that is. I always have to specify which one because there's Portland, Maine, not too far away. But Portland, Oregon, when the federal troops left, there was still the protest, but there weren't any riots or any violence at all the weekend after the federal troops left. And one of the protesters that had been there consistently made a point of saying, well, you know, the first few nights they were doing X, you know, like shooting tear gas. So we started wearing masks. And then they used rubber bullets. So we carried makeshift shields. Something in the throat. Apologies.
Yeah, it's allergy season. But yeah, so they, there was something I was going to mention.
So the escalation was coming from the feds.
Yeah.
And the protesters, they were just trying to protect themselves from being harmed. But the feds were saying, well, we have to escalate our response to the protesters because they have shields now. That they're using leaf blowers to blow the tear gas canisters back at us. Well, maybe don't lob tear gas canisters at people that are just protesting saying, stop beating us. Like that. Yeah. That's the thing of, oh, you want something to cry about? You want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about. You know, hey, stop the police brutality. You think that's police brutality? I'll show you police brutality.
Right. They always have to be the better man because they're the government and they're the cops and so on. And yet, when they initiate the hostilities, you know, they're never held accountable. Rarely are they held accountable. They have the full backing of the politicians, the wrong politicians. Yeah, it's crazy. It's no way to run a society, and it's not what America was founded on. This is not America's founding principles that the government is our lord and master and whatnot. It's what many Americans admittedly have asked for decades. Voting is a responsibility. Being free brings with it responsibilities. Some libertarians may say that's not a very libertarian thing to say, but I mean, if you want all these liberties, you have to fight for them. And one way you have to fight for them is to vote for the right people, for the right policies, and inform yourself about those things, and not just lay down and let whatever happens, because the people who want power the most are the very last people who should have it. Yeah. And that's the situation that we're in right now. I want to go back just a little bit to the racist element of the war on drugs too. This is something that I am familiar with. In my community college course, I had LEAP last year come to Great Bay and make a presentation to my students, which is very popular. And they made that point. What big part LEAP is the Law Enforcement Action Partnership.
Yeah,
used to be law
enforcement
against prohibition. And I had them come because I saw a great presentation 10 years ago at Harvard. Anyways, long story short, they did a great bang-up presentation for my class and some of the college staff as well. One statistic that reverberates with me is that 6 out of 10 people who are incarcerated for drug offenses are Black. That is nowhere near their share of the population. So they're 13% of the general population, but 6 out of 10, 60% consistently of the people who are incarcerated are Black. And they gave plenty of other evidence, exactly what you said. It started off as a racist assault on that community. We've gone so far down the black hole, this country. It makes me wonder if there's anything that I could do to make a difference if I do get elected. It's going to take 100 years of incremental work to repair all the damage that's been done on different levels, and to parallel what we started with an hour ago. Why am I doing it? Because, we have to start at some point. We got a long haul ahead of us to re-educate the population, educate them about what's really going on by stealth behind the scenes, who really has the power and what they're doing with it, which policies work, why liberty is a good thing. So much we've got to do that we all have to start right now. It really is the 11th hour for liberty and freedom and civilization.
Yep. And we are coming up on right at 1 hour of having started. So Robert,
very enjoyable hour.
Yeah, let's wrap up. So if there's any final thoughts that you have, how can people help the campaign? Do you have a campaign website?
I do. It's Robert Daniel Rep. I'm sorry, I can't punch stuff right now. I don't know if I have the ability to put it on the screen, but Robert Daniel Rep, Daniel with no S, .com. And it's still under construction as far as I know. Still says hello world. I'll go check and I'll fix that in short order. But you can still contact me through that. I would very much love participation in Ward 4, ASAP, the usual stuff, donations, lawns to put a sign on, and volunteers to help do a sign wave and help distribute mail and things like that. Because I'm going full bore. I'm spending a lot of my own money, which I have very little of, to give out. I'm going to do mailings. I've already ordered lots of signs and the whole business. Do what I can. And at least to put a name on the ballot that is an alternative. Yep. Do what I can for the party. So Robert, there you go. So please check it out and help me out.
Yep. Again, robertdanielrep.com is the website. Robert, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
My website, darrylwperry.com. The donate page is darrylwperry.com/donate. And you can also, if you prefer using the smartphone and you don't necessarily want to open up a browser, you can text the word Perry, P-E-R-R-Y, to 77948, and then you'll get a handy text message with info on how you can donate that way. Again, darrylwperry.com, robertdanielrep.com. And as I mentioned earlier, I've got Spike Cohen, the Libertarian for Vice President, coming on next week. So thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you next week.